In this video, you'll discover the complete story in Nero, from his birth into the powerful Julio-Claudian dynasty to the tragic suicide that ended his life. You'll see how he rose to power, his personal scandals, the Great Fire of Rome, the persecution of Christians, and the brutal fall of one of the most remembered Roman emperors in the history of Rome.
The history of Rome was marked by names that crossed centuries: Caesar, Augustus, Trajan. But among them, one remained shrouded in shadows, ruins, and flames: Nero. No other emperor divided opinions as he did. For some, a frustrated artist seeking eternal applause. For others, a cruel and deranged tyrant who dragged the empire into chaos. Amid spectacles, fires, and executions, his figure became a symbol of madness and decadence. But behind the image of the man said to have played the lyre while Rome burned, there's a real life full of twists, a story that begins not with blood, but with silent ambition. Before rising to the throne, Nero was just a boy with a promising name and powerful connections. He wasn't born to be emperor, but fate placed him at the center of the world's greatest power. Through family alliances and dangerous political games, the young Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus would become the most powerful man on earth. Still, even surrounded by glory, his path would be marked by insecurity, paranoia, and a deep desire to be loved, not as Caesar, but as a poet. The pursuit of recognition guided him more than imperial duty. His throne was not made of marble, it was a stage. Few emperors have inspired as much artistic production and historical debate as Nero. Ancient authors portrayed him with horror and fascination. Posterity split between condemning him as a monster and trying to understand his actions through youth and political pressure. Amid executions and luxurious feasts, chariot races, and family murders, he shaped the empire in his image. But who was Nero really? A tragic villain? A man ahead of his time? A symbol of everything Rome could have avoided? To understand his path, we must return to marble halls and corridors of conspiracy. This documentary dives deep into the life of the last emperor of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Based on ancient sources, modern analyses, and detailed reconstructions, we revisit every phase of his existence, from a childhood shaped by manipulation to his final days of flight and death. We'll see how his image was built, destroyed, and mythologized over time. We'll separate fact from legend and understand the context that made Nero such a complex figure. Because his story is not just that of one man, it's the story of an empire dancing at the edge of collapse. By following step by step the journey of this young emperor, we also reveal the backstage of Roman politics. Power games between mothers and sons, generals and senators, artists and slaves. The imperial court was an arena where only the most cunning or the most ruthless survived. And Nero would learn that too soon. Behind the spectacles, there was fear. Behind the poetry, there was blood. Glamour hid the muffled cries of a Rome few historians ever truly heard. This is the other side of the imperial coin. More than understanding the actions of one man, diving into Nero's story is a way of understanding the very mechanics of the Roman Empire, how absolute power can distort desires, intentions, and personalities, how the solitude of a throne can become unbearable even for someone who has the world at his feet. Nero's journey is a study in vanity, human fragility, and consequence, and also in the thin line between civilization and chaos. Because when an emperor dreams to be an artist, who governs the empire? Get ready to discover the complete story of Nero, not the caricature, not the legend, but the man, with all his contradictions, passions, and excesses, a young man shaped by the court, consumed by glory, and forgotten on the margins of history until now, because Nero lives still,
not in statues or coins, but in the questions he forces us to ask. What happens when you give everything to someone who never learned to say no? And what remains of an empire when the spectacle matters more than the truth?
Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus was born on December 15, 37 AD, in the port city of Antium, located about 50 kilometers south of Rome. Son of Agrippina the Younger and Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, his lineage was intertwined with some of the most influential figures in ancient Rome. Agrippina was the sister of then Emperor Caligula, while Gnaeus Domitius was a direct descendant of Mark Antony and great-nephew of Augustus, the founder of the Roman Empire. From birth, Nero was already part of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. The political context into which Nero was born was unstable. Caligula, his mother's brother, had taken the imperial throne just months before his birth, in March of 37 AD, succeeding Tiberius. His reign would soon become infamous for episodes of tyranny and madness, further straining relations between the Roman Senate and imperial power. In this atmosphere of conspiracies and political maneuvering, the safety and future of aristocratic families like Nero's were constantly at risk. Ties to the elite did not guarantee protection. Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus was poorly regarded by both the Roman populace and the senatorial elite. He was accused of adultery, violence, and corruption, and even cited as being involved in murder. His public reputation stood in contrast to his genealogical importance within the Roman aristocracy. Nevertheless, his marriage to Agrippina was a political arrangement, strengthening connections between branches of power within Roman culture. Their union further expanded ties with the Roman empress. Lucius Domitius's childhood was marked by tragedy and change. When he was only about 3 years old, his father died. Shortly afterward, his mother was exiled by Caligula, her own brother. She fell from grace after being accused of conspiracy. As a result, Nero lost the political support he had through his mother and was left without either parent early in life. The already unstable family situation became even more uncertain with his mother's downfall. During Agrippina's exile, Lucius was cared for by relatives and tutors trusted by the family. Without the presence of his parents, he grew up in the shadows of the Roman Empire, observing political intrigues from afar. In 41 AD, after Caligula was assassinated by members of the Praetorian Guard, Claudius, Nero's maternal uncle, became emperor. This change in leadership would dramatically alter the young Julio-Claudian's future. With Claudius in power, Agrippina was released and returned to Rome. Intelligent and ambitious, she quickly re-established her position in the imperial court. She began planning to ensure that her son Lucius would be placed at the center of succession. Agrippina's return also meant the return of her family's ambitions, which had been interrupted by her exile. A comeback brought Nero once again into the inner circles of imperial politics. This period marked the transition of Lucius Domitius from a boy marginalized by politics to a promising figure in the Roman Empire. His connection to the Julio-Claudian dynasty, once threatened by his mother's fall, began to gain strength once more. Rome, still reeling from Caligula's recent actions and under Claudius's strict administration, was entering a new phase, and young Nero, through his mother, was beginning to position himself as a strategic piece on the imperial chessboard.
The death of Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, Nero's father, occurred around the year 40 AD, leaving the boy without a paternal figure at just 3 years of age. From that point on, his care and guardianship fell entirely to his mother, Agrippina the Younger. However, her position at the imperial court did not last long. Agrippina, sister of Emperor Caligula, was exiled shortly afterward, accused of involvement in conspiracies against the throne. Caligula's decision removed Nero from the immediate sphere of central power.
During Agrippina's exile, Nero lived under the care of tutors and trusted family members, but without any influence or prominence within the political structure of the Roman Empire. The Julio-Claudian dynasty, though still dominant, was being eroded by internal disputes, acts of betrayal, and authoritarian decisions. Caligula ruled with severity, and his actions were frequently associated with tyranny and instability. The Roman Senate, under constant surveillance, remained largely silent in the face of the emperor's excesses. Without a father, separated from his mother, and distant from power, Nero's childhood unfolded in relative obscurity. He observed from afar the conflicts and scandals of the elite, still unaware of any future role in the history of Rome. The absence of a paternal presence and the instability of the empire under Caligula's rule directly shaped this early phase of his life. He was not seen as a threat, nor as a potential heir to the throne. The political situation changed abruptly in 41 AD, when Caligula was assassinated by members of the Praetorian Guard. The attack was the result of years of dissatisfaction among the military, the Senate, and even members of the imperial family. With Caligula's death, power passed to Claudius, his uncle, and brother of Germanicus, Agrippina's father. Although viewed as weak by some sectors of the Senate, Claudius assumed the throne with the support of the Praetorian Guard, marking a new phase in the Roman Empire. One of Claudius's first actions was to review the cases of exile and persecution carried out under Caligula. Among those who benefited was Agrippina, who was allowed to return to Rome with her full rights restored. Her return brought political stability to Nero, who once again lived with his mother in a more secure environment. Agrippina quickly re-established connections with influential figures, demonstrating skill in navigating power groups and seeking to restore her family's standing within the dynasty. Her objective was clear: to prepare the path for Nero to become a central figure in the empire. This new phase in Nero's life marked the beginning of his gradual entry into Roman political life. He received a careful education, studied under specialized tutors, and began to be introduced to higher circles of Roman culture. With his mother's protection and the stability provided by Claudius's administration, his trajectory started to shift. The boy, once removed from power, would little by little be placed within the succession plans of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. After her return to court, Agrippina quickly rose as one of the most influential figures in the Roman Empire. A widow, determined and politically skilled, she approached Emperor Claudius with a mix of cunning and strategy. In 49 AD, she married him, her own uncle, in a move considered unusual even by Julio-Claudian standards. The union had clearly political objectives: to guarantee protection, stability, and to pave the way for her son Nero's ascent. Shortly after the marriage, Claudius officially adopted Nero as his son. The adoption was not symbolic, but a legal and political act of great significance. Upon being adopted, Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus received a new name, Nero Claudius Caesar Drusus Germanicus. With this change, he acquired the same rights as Britannicus, Claudius's biological son, and was placed in the Roman Empire's line of succession. This maneuver was exactly what Agrippina had aimed for since returning to Rome. Nero was about 12 years old when he was formally adopted. From that moment on, his education took a new direction. He was taught by Seneca, a renowned Stoic philosopher who had returned from exile, and was also guided by Sextus Afranius Burrus, appointed commander of the Praetorian Guard. Both became key figures in preparing Nero for the throne. His education was shaped with discipline, blending philosophy, rhetoric, and the values of Roman culture. Nero's public image began to be carefully crafted. He started attending ceremonies, appearing on coins, and observing sessions in the Roman Senate.
The people of Rome, still nostalgic for the figure of Germanicus, Agrippina's father and Nero's grandfather, saw in the boy a possible return to former glory. His youth, combined with his lineage, generated favorable expectations among certain sectors of Roman society. The image of the young prince began to gain prestige. Meanwhile, Britannicus, though the legitimate son of Emperor Claudius, was still very young and remained distant from political affairs. Nero's adoption created a silent tension within the imperial palace. Agrippina, in turn, assumed an increasingly prominent role, often seen beside her husband and son during public functions. Her influence behind the scenes continued to grow, and many saw her as the true orchestrator of imperial power. Claudius, seemingly content with the arrangement, promoted Nero to an even more visible position. In 51 AD, at just 14 years old, Nero was declared an adult by the Senate, a political right that allowed him to perform public duties. From that point on, he began to make official appearances, giving speeches and participating in symbolic decisions. This move further cemented his image as a potential heir to the Roman Empire. This phase marked a definitive change in Nero's destiny. From a young boy once distant from power, he became a central figure in the Julio-Claudian dynasty. With an imperial name, influential tutors, and his mother's support, his path to the throne was being carefully laid. While the Roman elite remained divided between support and concern, the people of Rome were beginning to recognize Nero's name as the likely next emperor of Rome.
To further consolidate Nero's position as heir, Agrippina arranged his marriage to Claudius Octavia, the biological daughter of Claudius and Messalina. The union was formalized in 53 AD, when Nero was about 15 years old. The marriage united the two main branches of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, serving as a symbolic and political reinforcement of Nero's legitimacy. However, the relationship was marked by distance and coldness from the beginning. Nero showed no affection for Octavia, and the marriage quickly became a formal arrangement. Meanwhile, Britannicus, the legitimate son of Claudius, was near in adulthood. This reignited silent disputes over the succession. Agrippina feared that Claudius might change his mind and officially name Britannicus his heir, undoing all the progress she had achieved through Nero's adoption. Tension within the palace grew as the two young men approached maturity. In 54 AD, Claudius suddenly fell ill after a banquet. According to ancient sources like Suetonius and Tacitus, there are suspicions that Agrippina poisoned the emperor with mushrooms or some other adulterated food. The motive would have been to prevent a possible reversal in the succession plan. Claudius's death, though not officially attributed to murder, occurred under circumstances that directly favored Nero and solidified his mother's power. Immediately after Claudius's death, Agrippina acted swiftly. With the support of the Praetorian Guard, Nero was proclaimed emperor at just 16 years old, becoming the youngest to take the Roman throne up to that point. The coronation ceremony was conducted with great formality, involving the Roman Senate, military leaders, and representatives from major provinces. Nero's name was now officially linked to the title of emperor. During the early days of his reign, Agrippina exercised strong influence over her son. She actively participated in administrative decisions, appeared on coins beside Nero, and had direct access to political meetings. Many senators and commanders saw her as the true holder of power. At the same time, Nero began showing signs of discomfort with his mother's dominance. Despite his youth, he already desired greater autonomy in ruling the empire. Nero's reign began with a delicate transition. Members of the Roman elite questioned his ability to lead the empire, especially due to his age and Agrippina's constant presence in state affairs. On the other hand, the public viewed the new emperor with sympathy, drawn to his charismatic image and the hope for renewal after the final years of Claudius's reign, which many considered bureaucratic and conservative. Nero's coronation marked a new phase in Roman imperial history. Still under his mother's shadow and surrounded by experienced advisors like Seneca and Burrus, he began his journey as emperor. The tension between Agrippina's interests and the young ruler's desire for independence would soon become one of the defining elements of the years ahead. The teenager who took the throne carried both the prestige of the Julio-Claudian dynasty and the expectations of a new chapter for Rome.
In the early years of his reign, Nero was supported by two key tutors, Seneca, the Stoic philosopher, and Sextus Afranius Burrus, commander of the Praetorian Guard. Both acted as close advisors and sought to guide the young emperor to lead the Roman Empire with moderation and reason. The presence of these two experienced figures helped establish an initial period of relative stability and popularity, despite Nero's youth and inexperience. Under the guidance of Seneca and Burrus, Nero made decisions that pleased both the Roman Senate and the lower classes. He reduced excessive taxes, strengthened oversight of corrupt tax collectors, and promoted food assistance policies. These measures were seen as a return to Republican values, emphasizing the Senate's role and aiming to bring the government closer to the common people. Nero's public image began to take a positive shape. Agrippina, however, continued to exert strong influence behind the scenes. She insisted on attending political meetings, interfered in appointments, and sought to keep her presence visible in symbols of power. Coins were minted showing mother and son side by side, something rare in Roman standards. Agrippina's attempt to rule through her son caused discomfort among the elite and the emperor's own advisors, who saw her as a threat to Nero's autonomy. As the young emperor matured, the first signs of tension with his mother appeared. Nero began resisting Agrippina's demands, distancing himself from some of her allies and rejecting direct interference. The relationship between them, once marked by strategic alliance, began to deteriorate. Nero sought to build his own authority, while Agrippina fought to retain the control she had held until then. The conflict between them was intensifying. Despite family tensions, the government maintained a favorable public image. Nero organized public games, distributed food to the people, and promoted festivals inspired by Roman culture and Greek arts. He supported artistic expression and began to show personal interest in music, poetry, and theater. These preferences, while welcomed by the public, bothered senators who expected sobriety and traditional conduct from an emperor. This period was also marked by administrative reforms. Nero aimed to reorganize the fiscal system, curb abuses by provincial governors, and allowed slaves to file complaints against mistreatment by their masters. These measures reinforced his popularity among the lower classes. At the same time, discomfort was growing among traditional families due to his increasingly unconventional style of rule. With Seneca and Burrus still guiding the political direction, and Agrippina trying to retain influence, Nero found himself pulled between three forces: the adoring people, a cautious elite, and a controlling mother. This fragile balance would shape the course in the coming years as the young emperor sought to assert his full independence within the complex power dynamics of ancient Rome.
As the years progressed, the distance between Nero and Agrippina deepened. The empress mother, who had once controlled the inner workings of the Roman Empire, now saw her influence threatened by her son's increasing independence. Nero began removing his mother's allies from administrative positions and restricting her access to the palace. Agrippina, in turn, responded with veiled threats and attempted to regain the political control she had once held. One of the main sources of tension arose when Agrippina began showing favor toward Britannicus, the legitimate son of Claudius, who was still alive and nearing adulthood. This gesture was interpreted by many as an attempt to use Britannicus as an alternative to the throne, should Nero prove disobedient or difficult to manage. The mere possibility of Britannicus becoming a direct rival heightened the sense of insecurity around the emperor. In 55 AD, during a banquet at the palace, Britannicus died suddenly after drinking a cup of wine. According to historical accounts, the young man collapsed and convulsed in front of everyone. Suspicions of poisoning immediately fell on Nero, though no formal charges were brought. According to Tacitus, the substance was added shortly before the serving, in a dose calculated to kill quickly. The death of Britannicus removed the only direct competitor for imperial succession. The aftermath of his death was swiftly contained. Since it was common for Roman emperors to eliminate potential threats, the event did not cause major public outcry. The Roman Senate, already accustomed to such actions within the Julio-Claudian dynasty, did not resist. The general public was told that Britannicus had died of natural causes. Control of the narrative by the palace ensured the matter was closed without further consequences. With Britannicus out of the way, Nero solidified his position as the sole legitimate heir and absolute emperor. Seneca and Burrus remained as key advisors, but now held less power to moderate the young ruler's decisions. The death of Britannicus also marked a turning point for Nero, who grew more confident and less dependent on those who had helped him reach the throne. The political balance began to shift entirely in favor of the emperor. The conflict with Agrippina, however, did not end there. The relationship between mother and son reached critical levels. Nero began to view her as a real threat, fearing she might orchestrate his removal. Agrippina still had powerful connections within the Roman elite and was seen by many as a more stable figure than the emperor himself. From this point on, the estrangement became irreversible, and more drastic measures began to be considered by Nero. The elimination of Britannicus marked Nero's definitive transition from a ruler influenced by tutors and guided by caution to one who asserted personal power and removed his adversaries. The emperor's youth was no longer an obstacle, and his public image began to take on a more authoritarian tone. Once again, the Julio-Claudian dynasty revealed the weight of intrigue and betrayal in the struggle for power in ancient Rome.
With the path cleared of internal rivals, Nero began implementing reforms that would increase his popularity among the masses. One of his first measures was the revision of the tax system. The emperor ordered the reduction of excessive levies and imposed stricter oversight on tax collectors who extorted citizens. This action had a major impact on the poorer classes, especially in Rome and the provinces, reinforcing his image as a ruler concerned with the people's well-being. In addition to fiscal reforms, Nero invested in food supply for the capital. He created public grain reserves, distributed food during shortages, and ordered improvements to ports to ensure steady transport of goods. He also launched public works focused on urban infrastructure, particularly paving streets and expanding drainage systems. These efforts made his government especially admired by those living in the densely populated areas of the city who faced daily hardships. Nero's actions weren't limited to administration. He began personally engaging in cultural and artistic activities. He sponsored theatrical shows, chariot races, and musical performances, many of which featured his own participation. The emperor performed as a poet, singer, and musician, something unheard of among Roman emperors. While these behaviors disturbed the senators, they delighted the people, who saw Nero as an accessible leader passionate about the arts. In 60 AD, Nero created the Neronian Games, festivals inspired by the Greek Olympics, which combined artistic, athletic, and dramatic competitions. These events were promoted with great fanfare, drawn crowds from across the Roman Empire. Roman culture was celebrated with intensity, and Nero's name became associated with a revival of public life. His image circulated on statues, coins, and murals as a symbol of youth, beauty, and imperial vitality. The people's enthusiasm contrasted with the discomfort of the traditional elite. The Roman Senate disapproved of the emperor's involvement in performing arts, considering such activities unworthy of a ruler. Many senators avoided the spectacles in which Nero performed and distanced themselves from the festivities. To segments of the aristocracy, Nero's personality cult threatened the traditional values of ancient Rome, rooted in moderation, public dignity, and respect for institutions. Despite senatorial opposition, Nero was widely imitated by ordinary citizens. His hairstyle, clothing, and even his way of speaking began to influence Roman fashion. Young men tried to dress like the emperor, while artists sought to follow his style. Roman culture entered a vibrant period, driven by a ruler who saw the arts as both a symbol of imperial identity and a way to connect with the people. This growing popularity made Nero a contradictory figure, rejected by the elite but loved by the crowds. His government was defined by this constant duality. While enacting reforms and promoting the arts, he also steadily centralized his authority. The balance between spectacle, power, and politics was beginning to define Nero's unique style of rule within the long line of Roman emperors.
While strengthening his public image through arts and reforms, Nero's personal life entered a phase marked by scandals and controversy. His marriage to Claudia Octavia, established years earlier for political reasons, remained cold and devoid of affection. Nero maintained extramarital relationships with slaves, actresses, and common women, which caused discomfort among the more conservative sectors of the Roman Empire. Octavia, despite being Claudius's daughter, was gradually pushed aside. The most notorious relationship at his period was with Poppaea Sabina, an aristocratic woman known for her beauty and ambition. Poppaea was married to Otho, the future emperor, when she began her affair with Nero. Infatuated by her, the emperor escalated tensions with his official wife and sought ways to remove her from the political scene. Pressure inside the palace mounted, and Octavia's presence became an obstacle to Nero's personal desires. In 62 AD, Nero accused Octavia of adultery, a charge considered weak and likely fabricated. She was exiled and later executed by order of the emperor. According to ancient sources, the execution was accompanied by acts of brutality, including torture. Octavia's death caused public outcry in Rome, where she was seen as a symbol of innocence and a victim of imperial tyranny. Despite the protests, Nero upheld his decision and married Poppaea soon afterward. The new marriage, however, did not bring stability. Poppaea became pregnant, which was seen as a sign of dynastic continuity, but the pregnancy ended tragically in 65 AD, when Poppaea died suddenly. Accounts differ regarding the cause of death. Some say she suffered a miscarriage, others claim she was struck by Nero during an argument, leading to fatal internal bleeding. No version is confirmed, but the empress's death fueled rumors about the emperor's unstable behavior. After losing Poppaea, Nero entered a period of increased eccentricity. In a move that shocked all of Rome, he married a young boy named Sporus, who resembled his late wife. The boy was castrated, dressed as a woman, and publicly presented as empress. The wedding ceremony followed traditional rituals, and Sporus began appearing with Nero at official events. The relationship scandalized both the Roman Senate and the general public, generating rumors and satire. These episodes marked a turning point in Nero's public persona. Once seen as an artist and reformer,
He was now portrayed as a ruler consumed by lust, vanity, and emotional instability. Roman culture, which valued moderation and restraint, clashed with the emperor's private life. With each new scandal, the gap between Nero and Rome's traditional elite grew wider. The emperor's emotional imbalance also began affecting his administration. His decisions became more impulsive, and Nero's inner circle tightened. Close advisors could no longer moderate his actions. From that point on, personal and political matters started to merge definitively, signaling that the coming events of his reign would be increasingly shaped by excess and extreme reactions.
On the night of July 18th, 64 AD, a massive fire broke out in the area of the Circus Maximus in Rome. The flames quickly spread through the wooden structures that dominated the city's poorer neighborhoods. For 9 days, the fire devastated much of the capital of the Roman Empire, completely destroying 3 districts and severely damaging 7 others. Chaos overtook the streets, and thousands of people were left homeless. Nero was not in Rome when the fire started. He was at his villa in Antium, about 50 kilometers from the capital. Upon learning of the disaster, he returned immediately and ordered emergency measures. He opened the gardens of his palace to shelter the displaced, organized the distribution of food and water, and mobilized resources to control the remaining outbreaks. These actions initially earned praise from the affected population. Despite his quick response, rumors began to circulate that the emperor himself had ordered the fire. Some versions claimed he wanted to clear areas of the city to make way for grand architectural projects. Others said he had been seen playing his lyre and singing verses about the destruction of Troy while Rome burned, an image that became one of the most iconic and controversial associated with his figure. None of these accounts were confirmed by contemporary sources, but the rumors persisted. Faced with growing public suspicion, Nero sought to regain support by launching a broad reconstruction campaign. He ordered new streets to be wider, with more space between houses, and built with less flammable materials. He established new fire prevention regulations, including fire break walls and easier access to water sources. The city began to be transformed with a more organized and modern urban layout. At the same time, Nero began constructing his new and luxurious palace, the Domus Aurea, or Golden House. This monumental complex occupied a vast area in the heart of the city, with gold-covered halls, ornamental fountains, and artificial gardens. The monumental project reignited criticism against the emperor, as many believed the fire had been a pretext to enable his personal ambitions. The Roman elite viewed the use of public funds for private grandeur with deep suspicion. To finance the reconstruction and the Domus Aurea, Nero raised taxes and sold public offices. Inflation rose, and discontent spread among merchants, landowners, and sectors of the army. The contrast between the suffering of the displaced population and the opulence of the new palace heightened tensions. Nero's image, once associated with the arts and reform, was now viewed with increasing skepticism and distrust. The Great Fire of Rome was a turning point in Nero's reign. Despite his initial relief efforts and urban planning initiatives, the suspicions of arson and the financial burden of reconstruction damaged his reputation. The event cemented his ambiguous legacy. An emperor who sought to leave his mark on history, but came to be seen as a symbol of tyranny, madness, and self-glorification. From that moment on, the divide between Nero and Roman society would grow even deeper.
Amid the credibility crisis caused by the Great Fire of Rome, Nero sought a group to blame for the tragedy. He chose the Christians, a still small but growing community within the city. Viewed with suspicion for their exclusive religious practices and refusal to worship Roman gods, Christians became easy targets for accusation. Thus began one of the first organized persecutions of this new faith within the Roman Empire. Official propaganda claimed the Christians had set the city on fire out of religious fanaticism. Nero took advantage of the fear and outrage to justify mass arrests and public executions. Many were condemned to death by crucifixion, burned alive, or thrown to wild animals in spectacles held in amphitheaters. The brutality of these punishments served as a form of social control and as a reaffirmation of imperial authority before both the Senate and the people. Among those executed were likely key figures of early Christianity, such as the apostles Peter and Paul. Though the historical details are debated, Christian tradition holds that both died in Rome during this wave of persecution. Peter was said to have been crucified upside down at his own request, while Paul, being a Roman citizen, was reportedly beheaded. These events deeply marked Christian religious memory and shaped the evolving relationship between the Roman Empire and the new faith. The repression helped strengthen the Christian sense of identity. Rather than weaken the movement, the persecutions gave rise to a culture of martyrdom, where the willingness to die for one's faith became a symbol of virtue. Accounts of executions circulated among followers, and stories of courage under torture were retold as examples. As a result, Christians began to view Rome as an oppressive power, and Nero as the embodiment of pagan hostility. In Christian circles, Nero's image became associated with the concept of the Antichrist. Later writings, such as the Book of Revelation, referenced a beast whose number was 666, a code many scholars link to the Hebrew numerical value of the name Nero Caesar. The emperor, already unpopular among Romans, was now seen by many Christians as a symbol of ultimate evil. This association would persist for centuries in Western religious tradition. Culturally, the repression deepened the divide between traditional Roman values and emerging beliefs that challenged its religious and moral foundations. The repression positioned Christianity as a subversive movement in the eyes of the state. On the other hand, it laid the groundwork for Christian resistance and the creation of a separate identity distinct from imperial customs. The tension between the two worlds was beginning to take clearer shape. The religious repression orchestrated by Nero was more than a political response to the fire. It became part of a broader strategy of ideological control. With his public image damaged, the emperor used fear and violence as tools to reaffirm his authority. Yet in doing so, he unwittingly contributed to the strengthening of a movement that in the centuries to come would radically transform the course of the Roman Empire itself.
In the year 65 AD, one of the largest conspiracies against Nero's government was uncovered. Led by the senator Gaius Calpurnius Piso, the plot aimed to overthrow the emperor and restore a form of government more aligned with the traditional values of the Roman Senate. Piso's conspiracy involved a wide network of supporters, including members of the elite, equestrians, poets, philosophers, and even soldiers. The plan was to assassinate Nero during a public event. The discovery of the plot plunged Rome into an atmosphere of distrust and repression. Nero ordered the immediate arrest of those involved and initiated a series of interrogations and tortures to identify all conspirators. It is estimated that dozens of people were executed, including prominent figures in Roman society. The conspiracy served as a pretext to intensify control over the Senate and suppress all opposition, even if indirect. Among those affected was the philosopher Seneca, the emperor's former tutor and advisor.
Although there was no direct evidence of his involvement in the conspiracy, Seneca was accused of sympathizing with Piso's ideals. Nero ordered him to commit suicide, which he did in a public and ritualized manner in accordance with Roman aristocratic customs. Seneca's death marked the end of a period of intellectual moderation during Nero's reign. Another important figure from the early years, Sextus Afranius Burrus, had already died by this time, leaving the emperor without his two main balancing influences. From then on, Nero began ruling with greater autonomy and authoritarianism. He surrounded himself with loyal advisors who lacked the political weight and restraint of their predecessors. The Roman Empire entered a phase defined by purges, executions, and constant surveillance of potential rivals. The Roman Senate, already weakened since the time of Augustus, became even more submissive. Legislative sessions turned into mere rituals to validate imperial decisions, leaving no room for real debate. Many senators attended only out of obligation, fearing retaliation. Rome's political culture, once marked by power struggles and negotiation, was now dominated by fear and obedience. The provinces also felt the effects of this tightening grip. Governors and local administrators were frequently replaced under suspicion of disloyalty. Nero began using spies and envoys to monitor the loyalty of officials in distant regions. The centralization of imperial power reached unprecedented levels in the history of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, with the emperor exercising direct control over matters that were once delegated. The Piso conspiracy and the wave of repression that followed marked a new phase in Nero's reign. Now unrestrained, the emperor ruled driven by paranoia, a need to maintain control, and a constant fear of betrayal. Under his command, ancient Rome became an empire of surveillance, intrigue, and punishment, where any dissenting voice could be silenced in the name of preserving the throne.
After the repression triggered by the Pisonian conspiracy, Nero began to gradually withdraw from the administrative affairs of the Roman Empire. Increasingly isolated, he left important decisions in the hands of submissive advisors while dedicating himself to performances, travels, and artistic presentations. The emperor began to live as if he were a figure above politics, immersed in a routine that blended luxury, spectacle, and self-worship. The parties thrown by Nero became legendary for their extravagance. Banquets were held with hundreds of guests, abundant exotic foods, and theatrical performances commissioned specifically for the event. Many of these gatherings took place in the Domus Aurea, the palace built after the Great Fire of Rome, which symbolized the grandeur and disconnect of the emperor from the people. The elite were invited by obligation, and attending these celebrations became part of a loyalty game. Nero also began traveling throughout the empire, participating in artistic competitions in the Greek provinces. He enrolled as a poet, musician, and athlete, competing in festivals where his victory was guaranteed in advance. Although these trips were well received by the local populations, they were poorly viewed by the Roman elite, who saw them as an escape from his responsibilities as emperor. During these absences, the power center weakened and became vulnerable to internal disputes. Nero's devotion to the arts reached unprecedented levels among Roman emperors. He performed in theaters, recited poems of his own creation, and demanded enthusiastic applause from the audience. Roman culture, which valued restraint and gravitas, clashed with the emperor's exuberant behavior. For more conservative senators, the throne was being dishonored by someone who seemed more interested in personal fame than in governing the empire responsibly. His detachment from political reality grew over time. Nero came to trust only a small circle of allies, many of them chosen for flattery rather than competence. Baseless accusations were easily accepted, and former allies began to be seen as potential traitors. Fear and instability became routine in the court, while the emperor took refuge in his performances and pursuit of admiration.
Social tensions escalated as the central administration failed to respond effectively to the empire's challenges. Problems with food supply, inflation, and dissatisfaction in the legions were handled superficially or ignored. Nero's withdrawal from state affairs was seen by many as a sign of imperial decline. The authority once upheld by force and politics was now dissolving under the weight of neglect. This period of eccentricity and isolation marked the transition of Nero's rule into its final phase. The emperor's priorities were no longer Rome's needs, but the preservation of his image as an artist and divine figure. The distance between Nero and the Roman Empire became visible, both in his physical absences and emotional disconnection from reality. The stage had replaced the throne, and the spectacle, governance.
The distance between Nero and the reality of the empire became unsustainable. While the emperor cultivated his artistic image and promoted lavish spectacles, the provinces began to show clear signs of rebellion. The armies stationed in various regions felt neglected, underpaid, and without strong leadership. Nero's absence from military and political decisions created a power vacuum, encouraging internal dissatisfaction. The central authority, once feared, now seemed fragile in the face of growing discontent. The tensions came not only from outside Rome. Within the Senate, silent voices began to question the continuity of the regime. The sense of collapse was imminent. In the year 68 A.D., the governor of Gallia Lugdunensis, Gaius Julius Vindex, openly rose in revolt against Nero. Claiming to act in the name of Roman liberty, Vindex accused the emperor of tyranny, extravagance, and neglect of republican values. His gesture found support among the population and also among discontented military figures. The rebellion quickly gained momentum in other regions, especially among troops who had previously remained neutral. In Rome, Nero downplayed the threat and continued participating in performances as if nothing were happening. His indifference was interpreted as weakness, further reinforcing the perception that there was no longer leadership. In parallel with Vindex's revolt, another name gained strength: Galba, governor of Hispania. An experienced man and respected military figure, Galba publicly declared himself a representative of the Senate and the Roman people, directly challenging Nero's authority. Although he had not yet marched on Rome, his stance encouraged deserters and senators disillusioned with the emperor. Galba's brief alliance with Vindex was enough to cause panic among Nero's allies. The emperor tried to contain the crisis with promises of amnesty and reforms, but it was too late. Fear spread among his supporters, and loyalty began to crumble. The Praetorian Guard, until then one of the main pillars of imperial protection, began to waver. Rumors circulated that Galba would offer rewards to anyone who abandoned Nero. The emperor's once unshakable confidence was replaced by paranoia. He began to suspect everyone around him, ordering hasty arrests and executions, which only accelerated his fall. Without popular support, rejected by the Senate, and surrounded by rising enemies, Nero found himself increasingly isolated. The doors that once opened to welcome Claudius's heir now closed in the face of his decline. In Rome, the news of the revolts and Galba's rise arrived like a storm. The Senate, realizing the end was inevitable, declared Nero a public enemy. This historic designation allowed any citizen to arrest or execute him without punishment. It was a symbolic turning point. The Roman state, through its representatives, had officially rejected its emperor. Without the army's support, abandoned by his advisors and betrayed by the Praetorian Guard, Nero had no way out. The image of the divine artist could not withstand the weight of military and political reality. The stage had collapsed, and the final act was approaching. Desperate, Nero sought refuge in the home of one of his few remaining allies, a freedman named Phaon. Disguised, the emperor fled the palace at night, escorted by a few loyal men. Upon arriving at the estate,
He spent the next hours torn between tears, fits of rage, and delusions about his legacy. By the minute, news came that Galba's troops were approaching and that the Senate had ordered his execution. Faced with the prospect of being captured and publicly humiliated, Nero decided to take his own life. But even that moment was hesitant, reflecting the complete collapse of his self-confidence. As the horsemen sent by the Senate neared Phaon's house, Nero, with the help of a servant, drove a dagger into his neck. His last words were reportedly, "What an artist the world is losing." The man who once ruled the Roman Empire, heir to a powerful dynasty and lover of the arts, died not as a tyrant deposed in battle, but as a fugitive without glory. Nero's death symbolized the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty and marked the beginning of a new era of political instability. In the vacuum left by his absence, Rome would discover that the show was over, and the empire was in need of new protagonists.
After barely escaping Vindex's revolt and Galba's proclamation as emperor, Nero found himself completely isolated. The Senate, once hesitant, began to turn against him. The Praetorian Guard, sensing his weakening position, started to desert en masse. Close friends abandoned him, fearing reprisals or seeking favor with the rising power. The city of Rome, silent, no longer showed the fear of before, only the discomfort of an inevitable end. Nero, once hailed as emperor, now fled through the shadows. He took refuge in a modest villa on the outskirts of Rome, owned by one of the few freedmen who remained loyal to him. His disguise was fragile, and rumors of his presence there soon reached the ears of the soldiers sent to capture him. Nero wandered through the rooms of the house, disoriented, speaking in broken phrases. He had only a small group with him, no command, no escape plan, just waiting for the final blow. Those by his side tried to persuade him to act, but he hesitated. The glory of Rome had vanished, leaving only the echo of humiliation. The Senate finally declared Nero a public enemy. This meant that any Roman citizen was authorized and even encouraged to kill him without trial. The news reached the villa the next morning. Nero learned that soldiers were coming to arrest him alive. In despair, he asked his companions to dig a shallow grave. He placed a dagger to his throat, but hesitated. He murmured, "What an artist dies in me," a phrase that summed up the drama of an emperor who saw himself more as an icon than a ruler. It was his freedman, Epaphroditus, who helped drive the blade. Nero fell, bleeding, still conscious. When the soldiers arrived, he was in agony. One tried to stop the bleeding, but he screamed for them to let him die with dignity. A few minutes later, the last emperor of the Julio-Claudian dynasty was dead. His body, deemed unworthy of a public funeral, was hastily buried by the few loyal followers who remained, without imperial honors. The man who once ruled Rome absolutely now vanished into the shadows of history, rejected by the very ones who once cheered him. Nero's death on June 9, 68 AD, marked the end of an era. With his fall began a period of instability known as the Year of the Four Emperors, during which various generals would violently compete for the throne. The power vacuum he left was clear, and the political wound would take time to heal. The senators who condemned him began to fear the consequences, while the Roman people watched with both expectation and apprehension. No direct heir of Augustus remained, and Rome would have to reinvent itself. In the years that followed, Nero's image would swing between infamy and myth. Some historians accused him of embodying tyranny, while others portrayed him as a tragic man, misunderstood and victim of court intrigues. Legends began to emerge that he was still alive, hiding in the East, waiting for the right moment to return. This idea gained strength among the lower classes, especially those who had benefited from his social policies. Nero thus became a political ghost, physically dead, yet alive in the collective memory.
Nero's final image is contradictory. A man who began his reign with hopes of peace and culture, but ended as a symbol of chaos and persecution. His story is not only about an emperor's downfall, but a portrait of an empire, reflected in its own excesses. Nero's name would remain for centuries as a synonym for misrule, extravagance, and brutality, but also as a reminder of the fragility of absolute power. Rome, eternal, would carry on, but it would never forget the one who set it aflame, literally or symbolically.
Nero's death did not mark the end of his influence over Rome. Even condemned as a public enemy, his figure continued to provoke debate and reflection for centuries. The power vacuum he left behind triggered a chaotic succession, beginning the so-called Year of the Four Emperors. The institutional scars left by his rule forced the Senate and the military to rethink the empire's power structure. The throne increasingly became a prize of war. The stability Augustus once sought was now in jeopardy. Nero in life had blurred the lines between spectacle and politics, and after his death, Rome still swayed between those poles. Just a few years after his fall, rumors began to spread that Nero was still alive. Whispers circulated that he had fled east and would return to reclaim the throne. 3 different men even impersonated him, becoming known as false Neros. Each gathered followers who believed in their identity. These movements revealed that for some parts of the population, especially the poor, Nero was remembered as a benefactor. His subsidies, public games, and food distribution policies had earned him a certain popularity. Though hated by the elite, the people did not forget him easily. The myth was beginning to take shape. Over time, writers and historians began to record his life through different lenses. Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio described his actions with a mix of horror and curiosity. His artistic excesses, persecutions, and alleged crimes were widely documented. But among these pages, moments of generosity and talent also emerged. Nero's figure fluctuated between that of a mad tyrant and a young emperor under immense pressure. The memory of his rule became a battlefield of ideological disputes. Each author projected their own era's tensions onto him. Thus, Nero became a symbol, but never a consensus. In the arts, his name inspired plays, paintings, films, and operas. The image of the emperor playing the lyre while Rome burned became a cultural icon. Even if historically inaccurate, that scene was repeated for centuries as a metaphor for misrule. Nero's figure crossed eras as a representation of imperial decadence. Renaissance painters portrayed him with ambiguous expressions, sometimes cruel, sometimes melancholic. In modern times, filmmakers placed him in grand narratives, feeding the public's fascination. The real man had vanished. What remained was the character, shaped by collective imagination. Nero's legacy was no longer merely historical, but symbolic. Religiously, his figure was also reinterpreted. For many early Christians, Nero was seen as the first great persecutor of the faith. Some even identified him with the Antichrist described in Revelation. The number 666, interpreted by some scholars as a numerical code for Nero's name in Hebrew, reinforced this association. This apocalyptic portrait persisted for centuries in Christian tradition. Churches used his image as a warning against tyranny. Nero became a character not only of Rome, but of the West's spiritual narrative. His figure crossed into the realm of eternal struggle between good and evil. Yet in certain popular circles, he was still remembered with nostalgia. In parts of the empire where his social programs had been felt, his name was invoked with respect. Coins bearing his image continued to circulate for years. Popular poems praised his generosity. This duality of perception made his legacy even more complex. The same man feared in Rome could be celebrated in distant provinces. Nero became a mirror of the empire's contradictions. His name could stir hatred and admiration in equal measure, an echo that resisted time, and one that would continue to reverberate through the centuries. Centuries after his death, scholars still debate whether Nero was a political monster or a tragic young man consumed by power. His trajectory has become the subject of theses, books, and academic studies.
No definitive conclusion has ever been reached, and perhaps never will be. The complexity of his figure defies simple classifications. Nero was both a product and an architect of his time. His legacy remains a reminder of the ambiguity of imperial power and of how history can turn men into myths and myths into reflections of human fears.
Nero died young, at just 30 years old, but his path left deep scars in Rome. His body, rejected by senators and generals, was buried hastily in a modest tomb. Even so, the common people revered him as someone close to them, a people's artist, an emperor who spoke their language. After his death, rumors spread that he was still alive, hiding in the East. 3 impostors would later claim to be Nero. His image, though destroyed in the Senate, never vanished from collective memory. The empire, however, staggered. With no clear heir, Rome plunged into the so-called Year of the 4 Emperors, a succession of rulers battling for power through betrayal, war, and broken promises. The lack of solid leadership exposed the fragility of a system built on dynasties and favors. The chaos that followed Nero's fall proved his instability wasn't just personal, but a symptom of an empire without firm foundations. The death of the last Julio-Claudian was also the end of an era begun by Augustus. Nero's figure remained alive not only in rumors, but in art, literature, and popular imagination. Ancient writers portrayed him as a murderer, arsonist, and madman. Yet, among the criticism, we find glimpses of his love for the arts, his search for affection, and his attempts to balance the crown's weight with his personal desires. Modern historians still debate how much was true and how much was propaganda. In the end, he remains a character shrouded in contradictions, born at a time he lived in. Rome would move on, new emperors would rise, new reforms would be made, and the empire would reach new heights under other names. But Nero's shadow would continue to haunt the halls of the Palatine. His story would serve as a warning, an example, a curiosity, but never be forgotten, because to understand Nero is also to understand the limits of Roman politics, its passions, its games of power, and its silent tragedies. He was the distorted mirror of a Rome already losing its balance. Nero's legacy lies not only in ruins, but in the questions he left behind. Where does madness end and strategy begin? How far can an empire tolerate its leader's instability? What happens when spectacle replaces governance? These doubts echoed through the centuries and are still studied by historians and artists. Nero became a symbol of excess, of an ending era, of collapse disguised as celebration, an uncomfortable reminder of what Rome preferred not to revisit. Between lyres and swords, between applause and executions, Nero walked a lonely path. Surrounded by crowds, he was never truly accompanied. His end in a distant villa with only a few loyal men was the exact reflection of his journey, a restless search for control and freedom, love and power, glory and escape. His inner empire collapsed long before the Roman one, and his fall, though silent, echoed like thunder through the cracked columns of the capital of the world. And thus ends the story of Nero, the last of the Julio-Claudians, a name that set Rome ablaze, both literally and symbolically, and continues to stir fascination and discomfort. As we close this narrative, the aim is not to judge, but to understand. For history does not judge, it merely records. And Nero, with all his excesses and silences, was an inseparable part of Rome's history, a unique piece in an imperial mosaic that centuries later still forces us to look and ask what we really saw.